Back in junior high, I remember we had a Gulf War vet for a science teacher, who for the sake of anonymity I'll just call Mr. Marine. Mr. Marine was the kind of dude who obviously had his crap together in times of panic. In the 3 years we were there, I almost never saw him do more than crack a calm smile. Then, in 9th grade, junior high was 7th, 8th, and 9th where I went, this girl, Chloe, who showed up late to our first period class every day and was kinda quiet, she failed to show up at all. For some reason, instead of marking her absent, he called the office and had a very quiet conversation. He looked visibly disturbed and shaken. The next day, the girl showed up to class just a bit late, but with a broken nose, a black eye, and her jaw wired shut. Even though this was 25 or so years ago, I can still see the look on Mr. Marine's face when he saw her. It was pure, murderous fury, and even more terrifying, he pulled her into his office, had a calm conversation with her, and sent her to the nurse. He then told the rest of us that nobody was to say anything to her about it as she'd had an accident and was embarrassed, and most people didn't even really care. Quickly the rumors spread though. Did you see Chloe? Jesus, somebody kicked the hell out of her. I happened to be passing the office on my way home that night, and I saw the principal and 2 police officers, Mr. Marine and Chloe, in there with the door shut, and she was crying. One of the police officers noticed me looking and pulled the blinds. I normally walked home, so I waited. I think school got out at around 2:30 or so, and I usually hung around with some friends to listen to music or play basketball for 30 minutes or whatever before I started walking. I waited outside the front of the school until almost 4 p.m. Finally, a car pulled up and this dude gets out, looking just angry. He's swearing to himself, and as I'm the only one out there, he says, "You, where's the office?" And I just pointed, but he didn't make it to the door. The 2 cops came out quick, one in front and one behind, and the one who approached the guy started telling him to calm down. This angry dude just loses his mind, screaming, "My daughter should have been home an hour ago and I had to leave work. I'm going to sue." The cops are trying to calm him down. Then out of nowhere, Mr. Marine comes out the side door of the office, his face lit like the fires of hell, and he just straight up goes full horizontal, 4 feet in the air, and just body tackles this guy. In seconds, he's on top of him, and he's probably hit the guy 10 times, closed fists and all. And worse yet, he's not saying a single thing. He's not making any noise, just deep, rhythmic breathing like you do when weightlifting. Short breath in, long breath out, smack, smack, smack. The cops actually kind of take their time getting him off the guy. One casually handcuffs the guy, and the other handcuffs Mr. Marine, who is standing untouched except for some bloody knuckles and breathing steadily. Face red from exertion, eyes wide in anger and satisfaction, he's just not saying a word. I decide to walk home at that point. And as I'm heading up the road, an ambulance, sirens and all, flies past me towards the school. And the next day, Mr. Marine wasn't in school, and we had a substitute instead. By the end of the day, people were telling me the story, and it was completely wrong, of course. I heard things like, Mr. Marine pulled out a gun and shot him in the gut, or Mr. Marine stabbed him with that flip knife he has, or even Mr. Marine choked him out and almost killed him and now he's in prison. None of those were true, obviously. And then the next week, without any explanation at all, Mr. Marine was back. First thing I noticed was written on the chalkboard, "If you ask, you go to detention." His face made it clear that he wasn't to be tested and did not have any sense of humor about it. Nobody saw Chloe again after that. I don't know what happened. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I was telling this story to a friend, and he said, "Well, why don't you just look her up on Facebook?" I felt stupid that I hadn't even thought of that. I went to my mom's, broke out my junior high yearbook and found her last name that I'd completely forgotten, and I typed it into Facebook, and I found a couple dozen options, and her name is pretty common, and eventually I found her on LinkedIn, of all places. She ended up going to the University of Colorado, a master's program, and now works in finance or something. Her photo looked happy, which made me happy too. I googled her a bit out of curiosity and found some articles that she'd written for various anti-bullying and abuse awareness and management things. One of them was told like a fictional story almost. A girl came to school late every day, lacking in energy, and she had no personality of note and was quiet and meek. She wore loose-fitting clothing and she had a few friends. It was evident to me pretty quickly what she was talking about, which was herself. And in the story she writes, the girl had been physically abused for years by her stepdad, an abusive alcoholic, and it took a teacher with no training at all to determine what had happened and start the chain of events that ended the abuse. The point of the story was to teach other teachers what signs to watch out for, what personality traits to look for. And after that, I looked up Mr. Marine as well to see how he was doing. I was worried he was dead. After all, he was in his 50s and 60s back then. I found a few articles about his coaching. He had also been the baseball coach of the high school, and a note saying that he'd retired in 2001. Nothing after that, and no obituary or anything. I like to think that he's probably just sitting around watching reruns of some show that he likes, drinking beer and playing with his grandkids, who are probably about the age Chloe and I were at the time. And that's just what I like to imagine, anyways. I'm part of a volunteer search and rescue organization, and every year, our group takes part in a late summer retreat full of team building and bonding exercises. One of these exercises involves night training, which, as you can probably imagine, involves practicing our search and rescue skills after dark. My specific job title is SNR K9 Handler, which sort of encompasses why I joined in the first place. I always wanted to work with animals, I just never had the grades to study to be a vet. And so joining as a dog handler meant the best of both worlds. I could do something constructive and contributive with my spare time, all the while playing with dogs. I use the word play very loosely there, but you get the idea. Anyway, we were out on night exercises when my dog, who is trained to find human remains, started to alert us to a scent. I was partnered with a more senior member of the team at the time, but when I looked to them for some guidance, she basically said, "Let's just go with it." Now, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, your dog picked up the scent of human remains. Why weren't you freaking out? Well, the answer to that is simple. Even the most highly trained cadaver dog gets things wrong sometimes, and in a place like Washington, where we get California's annual rainfall on a Tuesday, damp scents can often confuse HRD, or human remain detection dogs. So, when my dog started to alert, our policy was basically just let him do his thing, because best case scenario was a false positive, and the very worst case scenario, we find some previously unearthed human remains, which, as horrifying as that'd be, was obviously a major part of our job. So the senior team member and I agreed to part ways temporarily. She'd wait on the trail, while my dog and I went off to follow the scent that he'd picked up. Since we both figured it was just a false positive, it would only be a matter of minutes before my dog lost the scent, and then we'd be back on the trail and on our planned route before we knew it. But then, a few minutes turned into like 10 minutes of walking through the dark woods, and then after my dog started to lead me down a fairly steep slope, I lost my footing and took a really nasty fall. The next thing I know, my chest is on fire, probably from the 2 broken ribs that I just sustained, and I could feel blood oozing from where I'd bashed my head on a rock on the way down. The first thing I did was press the emergency alert on my GPS, which signals base camp that one of the team needs assistance. The second thing I did was start calling out for my dog because I'd lost control of his leash during the fall, which I think scared him so bad that he ran off or something. That, or he just mindlessly followed the scent trail thinking that I was still following close behind. As you can probably figure, I was not feeling like my best self. I was in agony, I was confused, and having dropped my flashlight as well as the leash during the fall down the slope, I couldn't see very well either. I just lay there, calling out for Brody, hoping that base camp had someone closing in on my position so I could get to the damned hospital already. I don't know exactly how long I was lying there before someone showed up, but when I heard footsteps getting closer and closer, I felt this wave of relief washing over me. I started to call out something like, "I'm here! I think I broke something," assuming it was a fellow S&R volunteer, but the second I heard their voice, I knew that they weren't with our group. Like I said, we did all kinds of icebreakers and bonding exercises, as every year there tends to be a couple of new volunteers. But the voice I heard that night didn't belong to a long-term team member, and it didn't belong to the new girl or new guy either, as we only had 2 new faces on the team that year. It was a man's voice, and when they started talking instead of directly helping me, I swear, it sent this chill of fright running right through me. The voice most definitely belonged to a man, and they started talking about how I was in a dry creek bed, one that dozens of people fall into every year. He went on to say that at least one person dies there every year thanks to the flash floods the place sees during the rainy season. Someone falls, they get stuck, and then they drown. I went from asking for help to literally begging for it, but the guy just completely ignored my requests and carried on giving his little speech about how often folks go missing or lose their lives out in that area of the woods. I remember losing my temper and asking what the hell was wrong with him. And when he replied with something like, "You're not in a position to talk to me like that," I started to scream. Not wild screams of fright, but help. Somebody help, over and over, while I tried and failed to reach for my flashlight. I also cannot overstate how goddamn painful that was, having to scream when doing so made the burning pain in my chest feel so much worse. And around about that time, I started to hear my dog Brody calling out for me. He's part Australian Shepherd, and he's a very vocal dog, so I started to hear a series of awoos, trills, and rolled barks, all of which tended to mean, "Hurry your butt up, human." As soon as Brody started making those noises, the shadowy figure stopped talking, and then as we both started to hear the sound of Brody getting closer and closer, I heard that guy's footsteps as he made a hasty retreat. I think maybe a minute or 2 later I start hearing more footsteps, only they're from multiple people that time, and they came with flashlights. I call out for help one more time, and the next thing I know, 2 of my fellow volunteers are walking up the creek bed, and one shines their flashlight right on me. My first thought was to tell them about the guy that had just been talking to me, the one that had talked about the accidental deaths in a way that made me think that they weren't so accidental. I know that might sound kind of crazy, but the way he talked about them, like those deaths made him happy, it was one of the creepiest encounters of my entire life. So yeah, I told my 2 rescuers about the stranger, and one of the first things they did before administering first aid was to make sure that he was actually gone. One guy shone his flashlight all around while the other started asking me, "Were you pushed?" And both later said that they were scared that that creepy guy had been the cause of my injuries. Hence, one asked if I was pushed or not, and then asked if I was sure about that when I said no. But don't get me wrong, I was terrified that he was about to do something, especially since I was basically incapable of getting away from him. But he didn't cause me to slip. He was just there to see it, or maybe hear it. But that obviously raises the question of, what the hell was he doing out there in the first place? My 2 teammates then kept me company until the medics showed up with an ATV and a backboard that they could attach a stretcher to. I was then slowly driven back to base camp, given a quick look over, and then we headed over to a very rural medical clinic once we figured out my ribs were broken. Once I'd been given some pain medication and the doctors told my team leaders I was stable, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and a bunch of my fellow volunteers came to visit me in the morning to see how I was doing. And that's when I finally got a chance to tell everyone about the guy that had showed up in the minutes after my fall, and how his warnings sounded an awful lot like thinly veiled threats. About a week later, after I'd been discharged from the hospital and I was safely back at home, I got a call from that same senior team member that I'd been with before my fall. She asked how I was doing, how my recovery was progressing and stuff like that, and she then told me that the team leaders were discussing a change of locations for the following year's retreat. A couple of other team members had reported someone walking around in the dark, someone who definitely wasn't a volunteer, and that after talking it over, they decided that safety was paramount and that they'd be looking at alternative locations. In the words of one team leader, a second run-in with that creepy, shadowy stranger was not something they were willing to risk.
The town I lived in had always been surrounded by weird rumors. Whereas some of them were true, some were just a bunch of nonsense made up by the townsfolk. The one about the ghost with the dog head was the most bizarre among them all. I went there to live in the house I inherited from Granddad after losing my home in the city. The life of homelessness was something I never wanted to experience. That was why I went to the trouble of getting a job outside that town, which was about an hour's drive on each side. That night, as I entered the town while returning from work, the eerie silence of the place was deafening. It was the first time I had been this late from work, which was why I had no idea it would get so dark and scary at that time. As my eyes darted from left to right, I felt a strange sensation crippling over me. There was something weird and creepy about the silence. It hadn't been even midnight yet, so I wondered why there wasn't a single soul in sight, nor a human, nor an animal. There was nothing. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the surroundings as I walked. My heart was pounding in my chest, as I hoped to reach him soon. However, it felt as if it was taking forever. The town was relatively small, and usually it took me between 5 to 10 minutes to get to my house. That was why it was even more terrifying that even after walking for the past 15 minutes, I wasn't even halfway there yet. My terror mounted with every step and each passing second, which felt like an eternity at that point. I started doubting if I was too tired to take bigger steps. Probably I was so sleep deprived that I had started to hallucinate. I fought a rising panic as I tried to walk faster, but the only thing I was met with was a never-ending road. There was a left turn before I got to the street where I'd be able to see my house from afar, but it wasn't arriving. As I was trying my best to stay calm in that situation, I felt a fresh terror rearing up within me when I heard another set of footsteps behind me trying to match my rhythm. I wanted to know who it was, but I didn't dare to stop and turn around, for I was afraid of what or who I might come to face. I increased my speed, trying to shake the stalker off, but to no avail. The mysterious individual casually matched my speed and continued following me. This addition to unnerving events, on top of not being able to reach my home, was making me wild with sheer terror. At one point, I wanted to stop, turn, and just yell at the person to stop following me. But I'm a coward who had no courage to man up and tell the person off. When I couldn't take it anymore, I sped up and started running. The footsteps effortlessly kept up with my pace, no matter how fast I tried to run. Finally, I saw the turn, and after a few minutes, I was on the street where I could see my house. Just when I was outside my house and anxiously fumbled with my keys to unlock the door, I heard a terrifying whisper of a man behind me. Stop. When I heard that voice, I had stopped whatever I was doing before I knew it. It felt like a command I couldn't resist. I tried to move my body, but for some reason I couldn't. A fear that almost unmanned me had taken hold of my entire being. My hands were cold and clammy as I struggled to move my body, only to fail. That was when I heard another whisper, "Turn around." Terror thundered down on me as my body started to move without my will. All my efforts to stop myself from doing that were in vain. An unexplainable horror coursed through my veins as my eyes met with two monstrous gleaming ones. Just as the rumors, the head of that man was not human, but a beast. My mouth was open to a silent scream before I felt my eyes rolling up and darkness spreading across my senses. Before I knew it, my entire body went numb and I blacked out. When I woke up, it was already morning and I was still on my porch. A bolt of panic hit me as I recalled the events from previous nights. My eyes scanned the area, but to my relief, there was no one there. I was able to move my body at will as well. However, I was terrified. I couldn't help the thought that the creature would return to me. I didn't know how and why, but I just knew he wanted to kill me. I didn't want to die. The scenes from last night repeatedly played like a horror movie inside my mind that I was unable to shake off. I knew I had to move away from this place, but I didn't know where to go. It wasn't like I had a house outside that town, nor did I have enough money to rent a place in a different town. I had to somehow survive while avoiding him till I saved enough money to move somewhere less haunting. The following few nights, I couldn't fall asleep without having a nightmare. I told my manager that I was sick and couldn't come for a few days, and since I never took any leave, they didn't object. After cowering in my house, I finally returned to work. However, I avoided being late for work, and even if I did, I would stay the night at a friend's house. Though I didn't encounter that being again, I'm still terrified and think that he's lurking around, waiting for an opportunity to pounce and kill me.
Dear Sirs, it has been some time since our last communication. It has not been an easy 1.5 years. I have been anxious and worried and emotionally distressed since the disturbing events which were inflicted upon me at your company's Marriott Hotel. You will recall the unfortunate chaos that ensued when I checked in on that night. I had to awaken your employee at the front desk, and as doing so, in her drowsy state she checked me in. Your employee gave me the wrong key to the wrong room. She, in fact, gave me the key to the room which was already occupied. It was occupied by a man and woman who were actually engaged in and having sex at the very moment when I used the provided key to enter their room. When I walked in, the man was directly behind the woman on the bed having intercourse, and the chaos and threats and aggression which ensued thereafter were terrifying, traumatic, and disturbingly shocking to me. This man screamed at me over and over, "Are you a cop?" Then he came at me from the bed in the room, naked and aroused, initially, and was yelling obscenities and threats. The woman was screaming too. This man kept yelling, and when I could finally formulate coherent words, I stammered, "No." After he heard I wasn't law enforcement, the threats and violent nature of this increased exponentially. He yelled over and over, "I'm gonna effing kill you." By this point I was shaking, scared and confused beyond words. Since he'd learned I was one of your customers, like himself, and not law enforcement, his violence increased. He followed me to my vehicle and began pounding on my window and screaming, "I have your license plate now. I know what you look like, bitch. I'm gonna find you and kill you." I sat there staring straight ahead, shaking and freaked out, while he hammered on my car and shrieked threats and obscenities. Paralyzed with fear and indecision, I honestly couldn't compose myself for what seemed like forever, prior to being able to start my car and drive off, with him threatening me the entire time. Frankly, his actions spoke volumes. The man immediately, while still on the bed, thought I was law enforcement, and when he learned that I was not a police officer, his demeanor changed drastically, and he was threatening, aggressive, and terrifyingly, repeatedly threatening me with bodily injury and death. He chased me out into the parking lot and pounded on my car and windows. He screamed he had my license plate number and knew what I looked like, so he'd find me and kill me. Obviously he was enraged in an illicit and illegal sexual encounter, and your company was passively acquiescing if not facilitating it. Due to your employee's disregard for my safety and her negligence, I was subjected to one of the most frightening events of my life. Otherwise, with a couple engaged in sexual intercourse, why would the first thing the man ask be whether or not I'm law enforcement? It seems that with the lackadaisical staff and your freeway location, your company must generate significant income of such activities. As I'm sure you are aware, the doctrine of respondent superior holds your company for the acts of your employees in these exact types of situations and causes of action. I have been in therapy since this event. One weekly session is $350 per hour. I am constantly worried for my safety and that of my loved ones due to no fault of my own, and directly as a result of the negligence of your staff, I have been subjected to one of the most shocking and traumatic events of my life up until that point in time. Since those events on your property, if some vehicle is behind me for more than 1 to 2 minutes, I begin to sweat and my stomach clenches involuntarily. I am literally petrified when coming up to my parked car or going into rooms at hotels. When it's night and I see headlights through my home's windows, I get anxious. Everyday mundanities have become a source of repeated stress. It may seem unreasonable, but emotions and trauma are, by their very nature, unreasonable. But this raises its ugly head every day. I am 50 years old, and I have never heard of anyone experiencing what I've experienced on your property. It is unconscionable. I believe if he had a gun, I would be dead, and he would be justified thinking I was breaking into his room. My therapist has informed me that there is no time frame on trauma, and I will work through this, if at all, over an indefinite period of time. What I experienced was extremely traumatic, and my response has been the expected one. I would rather not sue Woodbury Corporation or alert the media and social media in a predominantly LDS community as to what transpired on your property by your employees' negligence on me. I have and continue to experience severe emotional distress, anxiety, worry and fear, which is ongoing and serious. It destabilizes and affects me out of the blue sometimes. It's stolen my life's peace and joy of travel. I try to avoid work travel now as much as possible, and that hurts my businesses. In light of the foregoing, coupled with the indefinite nature of my emotional distress and fallout related thereto, I hereby offer to resolve any and all claims and potential claims against your company confidentially for $65,000. This offer will remain open for 10 days. Should I not resolve these claims with you prior to then, I will move forward in a very public, litigious manner from then on.
Years ago, man, I'm old, but let's say the mid-1990s. I worked as a woodland firefighter while in the Army Reserves. I worked as a spotter, basically being stationed in a giant fire tower in the middle of a national park. My job was just as it sounds. I would use binoculars and look out for fire smoke and other telltale signs of fire. My nearest compadre was 5 miles or so from me. My days consisted of working my shift, taking long walks around the fire tower, being on the lookout for anyone who might be having illegal fires, looking out for wildlife, and staying afoot of bears and wolves. The way our shifts worked back then was 1 week on, 1 week off, so we slept in the towers and cooked our food, etc. One day on one of my tracks out for food in my Jeep, I came across an illegal bear trap. I had several ranger friends with me, and I safely set off the trap, then picked it up to take to the ranger station. Poaching is illegal in the park, and carried a big fine even back then, and some jail time. But it didn't stop the poachers from trying. I heard rifle shots, and headed back for my fire tower. And we did have a rifle in the tower, but only to be used in case of emergency. A few months back, a fellow spotter had been mauled to death by a grizzly, so each tower had been outfitted with a rifle. I looked with my binoculars but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. So I radioed my coworker Ben, who was an older guy in the adjacent tower. And he hadn't heard anything but had come across a few traps himself. That night, after dinner of frankenbeans and toast, I was riding to my future wife when I heard the rumbling of a truck, thinking it was maybe Ben. Occasionally he made the trek over and we would crack open a soda and chew the fat for a bit. It wasn't. Instead, I saw 4 men with rifles get out of the truck, one looking around and leaning up against the truck, whilst the other 3 grabbed traps and began to set them. I grabbed a rifle and my lantern and headed down the stairs. I was only 21 at the time, a farmer's son from a rural Virginia farming town. And even with 1 deployment behind me, I was naive. I should have called it into the Rangers, but instead, I thought I could talk some sense into our 4 dangerous men. I barely got a "hey, what are you doing" out of my mouth before I was roughly shoved by bare hands. My lantern fell, and I heard it crack. Then my rifle was kicked away from me. I felt the breath leave my chest when I was violently kicked in the stomach. I barely had caught my breath when I was grabbed by 2 of the men and was shoved forward into the woods. It seemed like we walked for miles, but in reality, it was probably only a mile. However, I noticed that there was no sounds in the forest, and it is rarely silent. It's usually a cacophony of sounds, even at night. Owls, wolves, and crickets. But on this night, nothing. Suddenly, I was shoved onto my knees, and I felt hot tears well up. Thought of my parents, my little sister, brother, and my fiance who were back home in Virginia. When I heard the rack of a gun, I shut my eyes and prayed. Then suddenly, the night erupted, but it was the sounds of sirens, those of forest rangers, and behind them in his pickup, Ben, who had tried to radio me that he had heard a car's engine and come to my tower when I hadn't replied. The poachers were arrested. Ben drove me back to the tower. I was still shaking. He didn't lay into me for not following the procedure, but just said that it was a close kid. I ended up leaving the job months later to take a job closer to home. But I never ran into any more poachers during the rest of my time. I kept in contact with Ben for a while and sent him a wedding invite and a photo of my firstborn son in 1997. However, as time usually does, we lost track of one another. And a few years back, I Googled him to discover he'd passed away a few years back. He would have been 75 or so. I don't know whatever came of those poachers, but I know I never want to meet them again.
I remember in 2008 when I was in the last year of high school, and our school was going through the transition. It was took over by another school. The new school was setting up new things, new boards, bigger classrooms, and also half of the staff was let go and new teachers were being brought in. We were sad to see that Mr. Costa was going. He was one of the best Spanish teachers we had, and getting a new Spanish teacher was something we were all looking forward to. We had a little break from the school till then, and we waited for the call. And then the call came after the vacation we just had of the 10 days, and the first day, we went. We were pretty excited, especially for our teacher. Our new Spanish teacher, we heard that she was some pretty teacher we would have. Some of them said that she was one of those Playboy girls, and some even said that she was the sexy nun from those weird Italian movies. I wasn't sure about it. Kids made all kinds of stories that you shouldn't really believe in. Then the moment came. It was our Spanish class. We were all waiting for the teacher to come in the class, and I remember the look on everyone's face. Kids were excited. There were already talks about the new teacher in the school, but it was our class that was the first one to catch a complete glimpse of her. And we remember even the male teachers were rounding up near our class, making appearances again and again, asking if the teacher had come in yet. And well, After about 15 minutes, she appeared. And when she appeared, I remember everybody was wide and staring. She was everything that the students were talking about. And I saw her, and I remember she was like a goddess. And I was looking at her and getting really mesmerized by the way she looked. And then the things just escalated too quickly. Then it can. She shouted at us, calling us idiots in Spanish, and told us to take out our books. When we did, she asked us questions. And as everyone failed, she would call us stupid. She was curvy, and every time she talked, her whole body would move, and the boys were constantly using that as an excuse to make it jiggle, and she was angry at it. And then she asked a girl to stand up and asked her. The girl said that what she asked was a wrong question, and then they spiraled into a long argument in Spanish. And as the teacher got angrier, her cleavage was getting obscure and visible to the boys who were having the fun with the argument. And then there was a lot of cheer involved, and the frustration was pretty visible on her face, and it was visible on the girl's face too, while all the classroom boys sat and cheered for the new teacher. I believe there was no way to assess where the situation was heading out to. Our class was completely nuanced, and it was the first day for the Spanish teacher, and she was already losing her shit to the bunch of no-good students. I remember seeing her so frustrated with the arguments and the boys shouting that it felt like she wanted to murder us all. And as I looked at her, I saw her moving back to her new improved desk and picked up the big fat Spanish book. And I wondered if she was going to point out the mistakes of the girl. But as she got back, I was witnessing irrational rage blinding a capable and reliable adult into complete irrational, illogical, and dangerous individual who was in charge of handling the students. She picked the book, walked towards the girl. The girl who was arguing with the teacher was Maria. Her father was Spanish. Basically, Spanish was her first language, and she even had a good command of it, and it wasn't the first time that she pointed out the mistake. She did that before with the previous teacher, and he even applauded her for that. And to me, that is why he's a great teacher, because he admitted when he was wrong and was not afraid of owning up to his mistake. And Maria was one of those prodigal geniuses, so there was no doubt that she wasn't wrong. She was thin and small with glasses over her face, and she was very stern when it came to academic stuff. So I was already rooting Maria's side, and while the whole class knew that Maria was right, it was the new voluptuous Spanish teacher and the boys were cheering for, and for a completely different thing. And as she held the big fat Spanish book in her hand, she came near to Maria. Now the book was a hardcover book, and she caught close to Maria and took the book and smacked it around her face and shouted, "Don't ever fucking dare to raise your goddamn voice in front of me. I will make sure you never get to next grade." And in that moment, the whole class went quiet. There was nothing. But then soon, it was followed by Maria shouting. The glasses she was wearing had glass broken, and that pierced her eyes. And when she got hit, the glasses pierced her eyes, and she was bleeding profusely by her eyes. And moments later, she was unconscious. We remembered the teacher freaking out and ran out of the class. We had no idea what to do, and kids were shouting when the teachers came in and saw what happened. And just minutes later, the whole class was surrounded by police and ambulance, and everybody was just in panic. And the new management of the school had one hell of the first day, and they were panicking. And when the school got surrounded by the parents, things just went off the rails. Even media was quick to get there, and people were freaking out and out for the blood of the hot-looking sinister teacher and the management who hired her without the background check or the demo supervision. While people were looking for answers and blaming the school management, they completely let go the real culprit. She was never found again by the police. But wherever she is, I am pretty sure she is causing havoc.
I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just say my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college. My father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I even had a phone. The story begins when, a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest, dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. Hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking into my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Something was waiting for me, and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily, footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but to my younger brother who visited, and to friends, and it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there around the cabin. And here's the funny thing. I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I, we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods, traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in, garbage, food and drink, paper, what have you. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel that you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch screened with a light door and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day, like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them, and this went on almost daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the front porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and I saw that hound dog who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect pointer position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on the porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It really wasn't funny. The final 2 gifts were legs, either from horses or even cows. Big and bloody. One was skinned, dear God. And the second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods howling on a trail following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in the following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland's suburbs of D.C., got an apartment with a friend, got a job, and moved on with my life. One day not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It's described as a tall, yeti-like creature, fur-covered, on 2 legs that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what had happened to me, following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. But I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick, and back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way, country folks. I think the monster was actually an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and just lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt, so to speak. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do, he would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed that I was leaving. Now, I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I don't think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill do die, but once in a while, they find their way to you.
This incident happened to me about 3 years ago when I was 17. Back then, we used to live in an apartment which was a sort of mini city in itself. It had all the facilities we needed, including markets, shopping malls, parks, schools, and many more. My point to tell all this is to make you aware that the campus was very vast. There were 3 blocks, and all of them were away from each other. We lived in the first block. If we talk about my favorite place, so let me tell you that there was a Burger King which was in the first lane of the 4th block. When it comes to burgers, there was no one who could compare me. It was my favorite place as I used to go there daily or 3 to 4 times a week. The staff members had also been familiar to me as I was a kind of regular customer. It was a normal day, and even after having my breakfast, I was feeling kind of hungry. But wait, that craving was not for homemade food, but I wanted to eat a burger dipped in heavy cheese along with some cold drink or soft drink. Without wasting my time, I hopped out of bed and went out of the room. I searched for my mom, who was working in the kitchen, and I told her that I was going to grab a burger. My mom knew about my habit and was always scolding me to focus less on street foods, but I never listened to her. That day was no different. She kept on shouting at me to stop me from going as she was preparing lunch for us, but I ignored her and ran out. I was walking across the lanes when a friend of mine saw me and asked me to wait. I waited for him and told him my point to walk out. Luckily, he was also planning to grab something to eat, so he also came with me to Burger King. We went there and grabbed a seat. He asked me to wait and force he would give the order. I waited for him while he went to the counter and ordered 2 burgers with cold drinks and little snacks for us. After giving the order details, he returned to the seat and we started chatting about some boys stuff. We were in the middle of our chat when we heard some noises coming from the other seat right in front of us to the corner. We noticed 2 full-frown men were ganged up on a lady and teasing her. They were having some argument which was not clear to us, but it looked like the 3 of them were familiar with each other. We couldn't understand the matter, but it seemed like they were quarreling over something. We were watching them continuously when the argument between them became serious, and they started pushing the lady and beating her. Within a flick of seconds, I could just figure out that the lady was screaming and 2 of them were hitting her with something. I and my friend remained there while looking at the scene. The whole scenario was too horrible, and we both were terrified. Soon, they announced in a loud voice and warned all of us in the store to get out as soon as possible. I just gathered the courage of all my life and no, I didn't go and fight with the murderers. I just ran away with all my might along with my friend. I was a kid back then. I had no clue what to do. Within a minute, the whole store was covered in silence. All the customers along with the staff members ran away from there, leaving that lady with those maniacs. Even while running from there, we could hear the lady screaming in pain, but we were helpless and couldn't help her. But my friend called the cops while running and explained the situation. We reached our home and sat there in a park while thinking about the lady. We were thinking about whether she was alive or not. After a few minutes, everyone started running toward Burger King. We knew this before, so we joined them and asked one of them about the situation. He told me that a lady was killed in the Burger King and the murderers flee from there. We all went there and saw the dead body. Everyone concluded that the lady had been robbed and stabbed to death. That time, I could see her face clearly, and I came to know that the lady was no stranger, but my math tutor. The cops also came there after a few minutes and asked us about the scene. We were the prime witnesses, but we were afraid to involve ourselves in this case, so we remained silent and didn't tell them anything. Everyone there told them that they reached there when the murderers already flee. The cops investigated the store and retrieved her body with them. I returned to my home and told my mother about all the things that I experienced. I was afraid and shocked, so she asked me to go and rest for a while. I regret to this date why I didn't tell anyone about this. Very much possible that she would have been saved if I had been strong enough to fight them. The scene and her scream are still fresh in my mind. Every night, I ask God to forgive me, because somewhere, I feel I am also responsible for her death.
We moved to Tulsa in 1986, right around the time Ghostbusters was becoming the new hit thing. The house that we moved to was about 50 years old, but the land it was built upon was registered to the very beginning of the country. As a kid myself, the place was becoming a scene out of movie for me. There were reports of several haunting incidents in the place. I soon became friends with Donnie. He was the local boy who knew the place by heart, and most importantly, he was also into the haunting mania. It was then that Donnie told me about the gruesome murder that took place where I lived 75 years before the new house was built. He told me that a father went on to kill his whole family because of paranoia, but the story is different. The place was cursed. But ever since the new house was built, nobody really heard about the curse again, as if the paranormal was normal again. I asked him about the previous family who lived here. He told me that the house was foreclosed because the man who lived here was unable to pay the mortgage and the bank seized the property. He told me the man also went through a terrible divorce and was alone in the fairly big house. We were playing with the Ouija board in the basement when my brother came back from school and told us that Mr. Parkson had hanged himself right in front of the schoolyard just moments ago, and the police had been called, and if we want to see the hanging body, we should hurry. It was something terrible to do at the time, but we were naive and we hadn't seen a dead body before, so we got on our bikes and hurried. The crowd was already gathered when we reached, and the ambulance and the police had just arrived. We saw the whole thing, and surprisingly, we were rather more intrigued than scared. We wanted to look the body up close, but there was no way they were letting anyone near the body. It was surprising for a lot of them, as Mr. Parkson never came across as someone who would kill himself, and that too hanging in front of the whole school. A lot of children were traumatized by this, but not us. For us, the needed intensity of trauma would have been much higher, and that is what made us different from every other kid in the town. As they shoved the body in the ambulance and cleared out the place, we decided to investigate the case on our own. So we sneaked back to his room in the school and tried to figure out what led to him at the edge. His room was a mess. Our first point was maybe a man would think of once sorting out his things before dying, but he did not. And it seemed almost as something pushed him onto the edge in the matter of moments. We gathered up enough evidence we could try to leave no trail of us there, and straight away headed to the basement. And there we laid down everything we had on him. Next day, we learned that the case had been declared a suicide, and there was no further investigation that would take place regarding the case. It was even better for us, as we could freely indulge ourselves in it without worrying that the police will get involved. The next step that we did know, according to all the investigation shows that we had seen, is to interrogate people who were closest to him. But there were only few who really knew him up close and personal, and one of them was a bartender in the town.
Next up on our plan was interrogating. So we asked the principal that we would like to hold a memorial for him, and it was so we can easily cover up for all the questions we were going to ask about him to people. And so we went in on it. Most people have only good to say about him, since they didn't really know him that good, and everybody called him a good person, stayed quiet. But it was the bartender at the Tulsa bar that had the most information about him. We went on. It wasn't easy getting in the bar, and then we did. At first, the bartender was pretty cautioned and alarmed, but then when he learned that it was about the school memorial, he chatted with us good. He said, "He was a good man. Been my partner in the side business we've been running for a while. Well, what you want to know about him, a colorful man, pretty damn good photographer. You should see the pictures he have taken. Well, never mind, said enough already." He smirked and told us to leave as there was nothing more to tell. But as we went out, he stopped my friend and signaled me to keep moving. He came out and I asked. At first he refused to tell me, and as soon as we were away from the perimeter of the bar and in safety of our house, he told me that the bartender invited him to give an expose of everything about Mr. Parkson and how it'd be great for the memorial. So in our suspicion, we decided to move on with the plan. We planned ahead and decided to do it, preparing for the worst. Next day, as the school got over and the evening broke, my friend went on to visit the bartender while I stayed at a distance investigating and recording. He walked into his room and was greeted, and then they both moved to his living room. Still in sight, there was no reason for worry. As they chatted, he offered my friend some soda pop. He accepted and went on to chat and write things that he was telling. Few moments later, what seemed to be boring conversation turned into horrifying emergency. My friend was suddenly lying unconscious on the sofa, and the bartender seemed to be tying him up. My first immediate response would have been to call the police, but I couldn't just walk away from there. So I waited, and I watched. He picked up my friend and moved on to the basement. He was in a potential danger, and I was the sole witness. So first thing I did was write a note in the letter. It said, "I and Donnie are students in Tulsa High, and we are trapped in the house of the bartender from Tulsa Bar. He is holding us without our permission. Call the police. There is something wrong." And I quickly wrapped it over a rock and tossed it through his neighbor's window. And that is when the bartender was alerted, and he quickly came out to check. It is then that I decided to enter the house through the basement and hid behind an almost broken cupboard. I saw Donnie, and he was tied and lying on the floor of the basement, and a small studio was set up there with lights and backdrops. I stayed there as quiet as I can be and watched what was going on. He then opened up a door through basement. It was a secret passageway of a kind. He went on there, and after a while, came back and brought with her a girl. She was naked and was tied in ropes. That was it. It was the trauma that finally scared me. I was scared for the life of my friend, the girl, and mine. Luckily, when he forcefully brought her, he heard a knock, and as he walked out, I walked out of the cupboard and decided to help them. It was the note the neighbors probably found it and called the police, but that wasn't the case. I untied both of them, gave the shirt that I was wearing to the girl, grabbed an envelope of photographs, and decided to run upstairs so he could get caught in action. Assuming that the police was at the door, I hurried up. And as I got up there, was the horrifying straightaway visible on my face. It wasn't the police. It was Mr. Musham, our teacher, standing there staring at me. "Boy, you sure bring your nose around everywhere. Grab him." Mr. Musham ordered the bartender, and as he was approaching me, I decided to make a run for it in the basement. As I got down, I saw that Donnie was coming back to his senses, but there was no point. We were trapped. Nowhere to go. We were stuck, and our plan fell apart as it was not the thing that we assumed would happen. He tied us all up, and then pushed us to a passageway through basement. As we walked, the darkness hit us, and the bartender said, "You aren't getting a chow for a day now. Sit here and wait for your turn." As I sat there, I realized that it wasn't just 3 there. There were 10 of us in total, all around the same age, minors. I had the evidence in my pocket. There was no way I was letting it go out of my sight. So the first thing I did was dig a hole in the muddy passageway and bury them. And the second thing I did was make a promise that I will save them, as I had already thrown a rock and a note in the neighbor's house. It was then that part of my hope broke when one of the girls said that she lived in that house and that her parents moved away after they couldn't find him. It was an abandoned house. Hopeless, I sat there. And then Donnie got back up to his senses completely and said, "We are not scared of him. All we have to do is think." And there it was. With my friend, the hopes were back. So I devised a plan, and I told them to do whatever the man is saying, and to get him to confess everything that he had done. As for the next few days, he got his obscene photographs of the underage minors. He through small talks disclosed everyone and everything from his partners Mr. Parkinson and Mr. Moosham to the murder that he did for Moosham that was the killing of Parkson. Not a single day would he drag me out that gave me the time to think even more, and there was the plan that I had made to tackle him. It must have been 7 to 8 days that he had kept us there. We had no idea. We had no idea if anyone was looking for us or not. And then he must have been in a rage that he decided to drag me out of the basement passage. Lights and days hurt my eyes, and I tried to adjust to it. And he brought me out and asked, "Where are the goddamn photographs?" I asked him, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Don't be smug, and tell me where the goddamn photographs." So I told him, if I can get a pizza, I will tell him. At first he refused and started thrashing me, trying to get it out of me. But there was no chance that I was telling him. So he gave up and agreed to the deal. He did not want to take a chance of leaving me alone, so he decided to call in the delivery guy, and that is where I found my chance. But he muffled my voice and pushed me back into the basement. I tried screaming my lungs out as the pizza guy came, and not a single shriek or of our voice reached him. He brought in the pizza and asked for the photographs. Seeing that my plan had failed, I refused to know anything about it, and so he thrashed me. I was near to my death. As I laid at the basement floor, wondering that my death is near, I was broken by the fact that my plan failed. But soon the bartender was called in by the Misham, and as my eyes got closed, I saw him leaving, and heard only one thing he said: "Tonight, I kill you." I was lying unconscious on the floor, not knowing what was yet to come. I saw nothing but pitch black darkness, and as I moved through darkness, I finally opened up my eyes, and there I could see the blinding white light over me, and that was my signal of death, I suppose, and it was the darkest back again. I kept drifting from light to dark and dark to light. It felt like eternity, until I got back to the light and found myself lying in the hospital bed, with Donnie sitting right beside me, smiling. I was in no condition to talk to him or to ask him what happened and how it happened, but there was this awareness that I had, and it was that we were safe. And for that reason, I closed my eyes and relaxed. The bartender was killed in crossfiring, Mr. Misham arrested and imprisoned for 2 consecutive life terms. There is no way he's surviving jail. And well, Parkson, he wasn't the good person anymore, and the case was reopened. There were more people involved that I couldn't disclose yet. For that, I will have to get back to the basement. As I recovered in 2 weeks, there was a report that the bartender's house got burnt. Too obvious. Someone was trying to cover their tracks, and they thought that maybe the evidence will burn with it. But that is not the case. I was greeted warmly back into my home. I decided to visit the basement. Donnie was already waiting, and as I entered I said, "There's more to this case. We have to find the